What are we doing today, ladies and gentlemen? So today we are going to discuss a little bit about the structure and composition of the corporate board and what the shareholders can do when they're making decisions. Because this is quite important in the context of the things that we're discussing. In previous presentations, we've discussed about the corporate board. So we know that it's formed of the directors, and you can have one or you can have multiple directors. And we discussed to an extent how these directors make decisions and how the shareholders can have some power and some influence over what's going on, but cannot fully control what's happening in the corporation. Because who is the boss? The directors are the bosses of the company. On a day-to-day basis, they're the ones who make decisions, not the shareholders. Now, clearly, if you're in bad terms with the shareholders, or what the board of directors is doing does not align with the expectations of the shareholders, sooner or later there's going to be trouble. But what we're trying to understand is the degree to which a shareholder that disagrees with some action can actually knock on the door of the director and say, I would like you to do something else. Unless you fall within a certain category of topics that we've discussed previously, but I'm going to mention again today, unless you're within that band, the shareholders are actually not authorized to say, I want something else done right now. So the structure is that we have a separation of management from control. Now, would you argue that this is a good idea to actually separate the people who own from the people who manage? Let's say that it was done the other way around. And let's say that the shareholders did have an active, ongoing power to intervene, not only for major decision-making, but also for day-to-day decision-making. What would be so bad about, in theory, one would imagine that the directors are in a better position to manage a corporation. But this is because we hope that the shareholders have appointed people who are substantively competent. In terms of the legal requirement, the only legal requirement to be a company director is that you're at least 16 years of age. There are no positive attributes required. So you could appoint anybody that has finished secondary school. Actually, it doesn't even require that you finish school. It just requires that you're 16. You could appoint any 16-year-old to be a company director. It could be that they know absolutely nothing. So we hope that since the shareholders are the ones that appoint the directors, they actually choose people who are capable of doing something. It's possible, though, that the shareholders also know how to do stuff. And since it's their own property, the company effectively is their property, maybe they're in a better position to make decisions about this. Now, it has to be the majority of the shareholders. Because when we're talking about the shareholders, we're not talking about individual people who are shareholders. We're talking about somebody who commands a majority at general meeting, or a group of people who command majority. So every time I say that the shareholders go and ask for something, I'm assuming that this represents the majority of the shareholders. If it was somebody in a minority position in the general meeting, then the directors can clearly ignore them and they say, okay, maybe you want something, but since the rest of them are not interested, then we're not going to do anything. So why is it not an advantage to give the people who actually own the place the opportunity to intervene directly whenever they want, since this has to do with the way their property is managed? If they cannot be involved much and they don't want to, then they won't turn up. So the concern is mostly for excluding the people who do have an opinion and they do have the capacity and they do want to be involved. The law currently excludes them. It says that you can only be involved in specific settings. You cannot just ask the directors to do stuff all day long. If they don't feel that they could participate, then they don't have to. Nobody says they have to. But I'm just trying to investigate why is it that the law puts shareholders in this particular corner and we perceive it as a problem if they have more intense rights to participate. Okay, so one argument could be that if you have shareholders that have got strong opinions, but these strong opinions are not based on the facts, because they don't have access to the same information as the board of directors, then maybe they force the board of directors to do stuff that are actually not particularly clever. The problem is that shareholders are primarily interested about themselves. But we can say that the directors are supposed to run the company in the interest of the shareholders. That is embedded in the law. But we should not equate that to mean existing shareholders, because the directors have an obligation to the company in and of itself. That includes the people who are currently shareholders, but it also includes the people who are going to be shareholders in the future. So if you allow the current shareholders to be disruptive, then they're likely to do things that improve their position right here and now, but these things might be detrimental for shareholders in the future. Like a typical example is, if you ask the shareholders how much would you like as dividend payments, they're going to say as much as possible. They're never going to say, well, don't give us all of it now, keep some to reinvest in the company. They're most likely to say, we would like as much return on our investment right now as is possible. But that might not be the best thing to do for the company. But it's a legitimate and live debate. And it keeps coming back. Theresa May, for instance, there was they change so often that it's pointless to give them numbers anymore. But she was Prime Minister of the UK for a spell of time, a little bit earlier. She made this a big deal. So she was very keen on company law reform in order to allow the shareholders to have more say in company decision making. And she gave a large number of speeches where she was suggesting this and promoting this idea. We never got to the point of specificity that she would tell us exactly what that meant, because already the shareholders have a great deal of power that most of the time they choose not to exercise it. So giving them additional rights would mean what exactly? So I don't know. She never managed to tell us before they booted her out. And the government is not tremendously interested in company law reform, so far as I get it. Even though the last King's speech had a great deal of legal reform on it, that's actually sensible measures that have been kind of pending for a very long time. I'm guessing they suggested them because they know that this parliament won't be around long enough to actually pass any of this legislation. So they just said, oh, we're going to do a whole bunch of nice things and actually do nothing. Having a debate as to how the shareholders should be involved and why they should be involved is legit. Now, the rest of the planet is happy with this distinction between management and ownership. If people with a short-term mind frame are in the majority, then they're going to push company to make decisions that just increase the share value right now or increase the dividends payments right now, which clearly might be detrimental to the future of the company. So the shareholders are not represented in the corporate board. They have some residual powers, but they don't really have a seat at the table beyond the statutory defined opportunities to be involved in decision making. Now, the smaller the company is, and the closer the identity of the board to the shareholders, the less relevant these distinctions are. Because if we're talking about a private limited company where the same people, there's like 3 shareholders and the 3 people are also directors, then there's a total alignment of interests between what they do in their capacity as shareholders and what they do in their capacity as directors. But for bigger corporations, where the major shareholders are not themselves sitting in the board, then we need to be aware of what this distinction actually means in practice. So the shareholders are not part of the corporate board. But if you're thinking of the best way to organize a corporate board, maybe there should be other people that ought to be represented in the board. What about the employees, for instance? What about splitting the board in 2 sections One section has an executive function, so they actually have specific tasks, operational tasks that have to do with the management of the company. And the other part has a supervisory role. Some people who don't actually do stuff day to day, negotiate and sign contracts and oversee operations, but they take a view on strategic direction, on, say, product development, but on a more kind of high level, thinking about how the company could evolve in the future to do best in its operations and so on. In this country, there is no direct legal provision as to how the board should be internally structured. It's possible that you have a few directors and they all have a defined executive role. It's possible that you've got other components of the business represented in the corporate board. It's also possible that you have some executives that don't have a direct operational function, but they're there to oversee. In other countries, it's very common to have employee representation in the corporate board. In Germany, for instance, they have a two-tier board. One part is executive, one part is overseeing, and the employees get to have a seat on the table because their representatives are part of the supervisory part of the board. Now, do you think that would be a good idea to have the employees represented at the corporate, at the director's level? Isn't the corporation, in effect, the totality of its employees working towards a common goal? Because if you don't, like, what is this place without its employees? It's a brand name and, a bunch of EDI statements. What is like marketing in isolation, right? So if you don't perceive the business through the actions of its employees, you might not have much of a business. So if in this place, everybody who works here detests the place and everybody quits every 5 minutes, like the second they find another job, they're out of it. And when they are actually working in here, they just do the bare minimum to get by because they don't want to be here. They just collect the salary and then they kind of run home. This isn't really a strategy for success. And the assumption is that if you have the employees represented at corporate level where the decisions are made, it's more likely that the company is going to take decisions that lead to a healthier work environment, that the concerns of the employees are heard on a more direct level. Not that you don't have avenues. We've got our union here, it communicates with management and all the rest of it, but the union is still not part of the governance structure. So if you had the employees represented and sitting on the same table as the bosses, and they have a say when they're making decisions, then maybe that results in the concerns of the workforce being addressed, a happier workforce, and a happier workforce tends to be more productive because it puts more effort into it, because they stick there for longer and all the rest of it. I think this is the logic that motivates the sort of two-tier board that you have in many European countries, because they realize that incorporating the concerns of the various stakeholders of the business and having them present at the corporate board level is a quicker way to address any issues than doing without this. Now, in this country, as I said, the law does not mandate a particular structure in the board. The company can decide for itself. It represents this in its articles of association, and they go with this. As if the shareholders would like to have a different structure in the board, then they can change the articles of association. So the articles of association mandate how the board is set up, what is its membership, how they make decisions. So if they would like somebody else, one of the stakeholders, to be represented in the board, then they can change the articles of association to that effect, and it's perfectly fine. Nobody's going to tell you no. So what I'm trying to say is that the law here does not make it obligatory as it does in other countries, but you still have the option to do it if the people within the company think it's a good idea. Where you get into a slightly more kind of forceful view as to how you should organize yourself is when we look at public corporations. Because for public corporations, there's an expectation, because they're bigger and there are more people involved and they're more financially important, and because they affect the wider public, because shares, if listed in the stock market, they're available to the wider public, there is an expectation that they follow best practice advice, and the best practice advice is that there are some people who have an operational function and some people who have a supervisory function. That's why you have all this debate about non-executive directors. Have you guys ever heard this notion of non-executive directors? Doesn't have a direct operational role, because one director might be in charge of marketing, the other director might be in charge of sales, the other one might be in charge of HR and employee relationships, right? One could be in charge of overseeing manufacturing activity or whatever. Non-executive directors do not have a specific task, but their job is to check what everybody else has done. So a sort of internal supervisory board. So a lot of people who are, who've been doing this for a while and they're quite senior in their careers, they get asked to serve as non-executive directors in other corporations this doesn't mean that they actually work for them, they don't do stuff on a day-to-day basis, but they can contribute the knowledge and experience in helping the other corporation succeed. Companies that are listed in the London Stock Exchange, they are supposed to comply with the UK Corporate Governance Code. Now, this is a code of best practice suggestions or rules. It's not law as such. So this doesn't come from the Companies Act. So it's not obligatory in that sense. But it is obligatory in the sense that if you voluntarily take the step to join the stock market, then the Corporate Governance Code forms part of the obligations that come with being in the stock market. And the Corporate Governance Code does mandate certain things about the structure of the board. One of these things is that you have a group of non-executive directors. Why did they think that this is kind of best practice advice, and where does all this come from? It comes from a long series of corporations doing poorly. And there have been successive investigations and reports as to why these corporations do poorly and what should be done about it. The outcome of many of these discussions has been to propose that non-executive directors are appointed and they've got specific functions. What happens in this country is that every time something goes wrong, even though everybody knows perfectly well why it went wrong, nobody has the balls to say it. Now, as a face-saving exercise and a kind of cover-your-ass exercise, every time something fails, they will set up a commission to investigate. Some old, white, rich dude is going to be appointed to chair the commission. They're going to spend money for 2 or 3 years appointing all their friends as consultants to help them with the commission. So a bunch of other rich white guys make a lot of money out of this. And eventually, they're going to tell you what you knew all along. But because there's been a commission that set up inquiries and did interviews and called people to speak and investigated all the evidence and gathered all the stuff to tell you that the bears usually shit in the woods, when the report comes out, everybody can pretend that this is at enough of a distance from what is actually going on not to have a great deal of personal impact. So this is a beautiful way to address issues because, as I said, you can always scapegoat somebody random, you can always diffuse responsibility, you can delay the outcome, because when something big, bad happens now and you quickly address it, everybody knows that the big bad thing happened. If you set up a committee and the response to the big bad thing is 5 or 10 years down the line, nobody even remembers what you're talking about. Yeah, tried and tested technique that this country has perfected. every time there was a big corporate failure, even though the reasons were blatantly obvious, the reasons usually are rich people doing stupid things because they just get ahead of themselves. Yeah. Then you need a committee, some senior judge to oversee, blah blah blah, inquiries, interviews, consultants, millions wasted. Now, again and again and again, there've been various reports. All the reports say exactly the same thing: that bad things happen when a small group of people become too incestuous and talk to themselves and convince themselves that doing stupid things is a good idea. And the way to prevent privileged people from doing stupid things is to get somebody else who's a little bit outside the group, check what they're doing, and tell them when they're coming off the rails. Simple, isn't it? Same thing works for everything. Could work for this place. When you only listen to the people who clap along and you're surrounded by a group of sycophants who tell you what you want to hear, when you start to make bad decisions, they will continue to clap along and tell you how great you are, till you actually make a significant mistake that then causes a significant amount of damage. If you had a group of external people, you give them the tools, you give them the data, you give them the opportunity to oversee what you're doing. And you then listen to their advice when they try to tell you that what you're doing is perhaps too risky, too dangerous, or the wrong thing. And then you act on that advice, then there's an expectation that this will minimize catastrophic things from happening, right? Or will reduce the chance that these things are happening. That's why in the corporate governance code, the two-tier board is recommended. So you have an executive function and a non-executive function to do this checking process. It is a terrific idea. I mean, I don't think anybody disagrees with this, do you? You know how we're so keen on feedback? Yeah? In some circumstances, it's great to have a group of people that tell you, I don't like it. Assuming that it comes with, some specifics as to what it is that they don't like and what they think you should do in response. Yeah? Now, one might argue, if this has been around for donkey's years and all the public listed corporations in the London Stock Exchange on whom these rules are applicable do have non-executive directors, why do we come across the phenomenon that you have executive boards that are dominated by particular individuals who are domineering and obsessive and have agendas that are incompatible with the benefit of the company, and they do the wrong things and the companies end up failing? Either there's something wrong at design level, that having a non-executive part of the board isn't actually helping, or it is not utilized properly. Now, my personal view, which I think is kind of validated by the evidence, is that it is not working because you still have a closed group of people. That the sort of powerful individuals that are likely to be making the wrong decisions when they're in charge of corporations and not have in mind the interest of stakeholders or even their own shareholders and all the rest of it, they will appoint their friends at the non-executive board. And then they will be rewarded themselves by being appointed in non-executive positions on their friends' boards. So it becomes all kind of an enormous back-scratching exercise organized through private members clubs that, the elite here is so keen on, that everybody appoints their mates to supposedly oversee what they're doing. So if the executive part of the board is populated by incompetent sycophants, then there's a very high chance that the non-executive board is occupied by exactly the same people. It's just that you pay them less because you don't ask them to do as much. That's why the problem persists. So the problem is one of corporate culture and perhaps lack of diversity in the backgrounds and interests and profiles of the people who are at high executive positions. We keep coming back to the same issue. It's a great idea in terms of design, because if you don't have it and you just have the executive board, then you end up in kind of Robert Maxwell type situations, that there's some sort of powerful individual that bosses everybody else around and the catastrophic consequences come about. But the way that it's been set up now, even though the design advice is solid, the implementation is poor. But that cannot be fixed by legal measures. Maybe it can be fixed by the shareholders actually having a better look at the people they appoint in the board. Because the non-executive directors are also directors. They're also proper full directors. They just have a different thing to do. They are appointed by the shareholders. So maybe the shareholders should have more ownership of the process of appointment and actually look more carefully at the types of people that they appoint in corporate boards to carry out these roles effectively, and not appoint the mates of the existing directors whenever they're suggested. Now, and for that, guys, you don't need a change in the law. So I don't know what Theresa May was so excited about. All the tools to actually do this are already in place. It's just that shareholders do not take the opportunity to appropriately scrutinize corporate appointments, and they appoint the wrong people. We have mentioned in the past the potential of activist investors to have some influence on this. It happens, and this works actually, and it's quite helpful. People, what we say by activist investors are people who have enough of a foothold in the general meeting, they own enough shares to actually make recommendations, bring things to a vote and so on, and they come up with an explanation of the situation. They point out the deficiencies in the board, and they suggest that the shareholders replace the board with somebody else who's likely to do a better job. No, but it's a good illustration of the system working. If an activist investor comes in, demonstrates to the general meeting that they're doing a poor job, and the shareholders, by a simple majority, say, actually, you know what? Yeah. And they put new people, it's evidence that this is in fact working. These discussions are kind of more relevant for bigger corporations, and the shareholding is a little bit diverse. So it's unlikely that in a listed corporation you're going to have somebody who owns nearly half the shares. Normally people have got smaller levels of shareholding. Yeah. So it would be a group of shareholders that in their totality have got almost half the shares. Yeah. Since the corporate governance code is part of what the stock market requires of you to be there, if everybody agrees, if everybody who's in this business agrees that this is a sensible way to organize stuff, and you've got an entire code that says this is the best, this is what the whole debate about corporate governance is about. Like, you know, we've been looking at this stuff for 100 years, and we came up with this set of rules that say this is the most efficient way to organize a corporate board. This is why we should have distinct roles. This is what different people should do. And it's, if you want to be part of the stock market, it's a requirement that you consider this. If the company's answer is that, nah, I don't care. We have a brilliant leader and we don't need anybody else. They say, this is a best practice thing. If you don't want to do it, and your shareholders are happy with you not doing it, and it all goes wrong, then guess what? Your shareholders lose out. It's not the job of the regulator or the state, whomever, to chase after. In the same way, you shouldn't wash your colors with your whites. You ignore this advice at your peril, then everything is pig. So do not wash your new Grinch onesie with your whites, because everything will be green. Okay, fine. So it's their own money. They want to do stupid things and lose them. You know, they're going to wash their clothes without paying attention. They're going to suffer the consequence. Okay. But you could say the same thing about a bunch of stuff, right? Why do we have restrictive legislation on other things? Why do we have explicit provisions in labor law about how you treat your employees? You could use the same argument there and say you're allowed to do whatever you want, and if you treat them shittily, they're all just going to quit and your business is going to fail. There are other people, because now we're thinking about the directors and the shareholders. They're supposedly on the driving seat of this, right? But there are other people that we call the stakeholders of the business that don't get to make any decisions, but they are affected. So if in this place management makes idiotic decisions and they shut it down, all of us are going to be without a job, which isn't going to be very pleasant. It's going to be liberating, but not pleasant. So you could argue that the bigger the corporation, and here we're talking about the big ones because the tiny corporations are not in the stock market. Big corporations failing because they refuse to follow best practice advice does have negative social consequences. It might affect employment. It might affect a whole bunch of other people who do business with them. When Carillion, the big construction company, went bust a few years ago, it wiped out an immense range of suppliers, contractors. There were people who were supplying them with the materials because they were a big construction company. There were a lot of plumbers, electricians, builders who were working for them that either lost their contracts if they were separate companies or they found themselves directly unemployed. So there are negative consequences for the rest of society, or perhaps consequences destabilizing from the economy that can come about if a company is poorly run. So I'm not 100% on the idea that the shareholders might do stupid things and then they suffer the consequences of their own stupid decisions, because when you get on the bigger scale, these consequences fall on other people who really are not to blame. This is not debatable in the law. Currently, corporate governance structures are not enforced through regulation. The system is called comply or explain, meaning the obligation of the corporate board is to follow the corporate governance code, and if they choose not to do so, then they need to explain why they're not following it to their own shareholders. What are the shareholders going to do? If they don't care, they do nothing. If they do care, they dismiss the board and change them with somebody else. That's what you do as a shareholder if you're unhappy with decision making. You get rid of these people and you put in place different people who are going to do things in a different way. I think this is weak as an arrangement. I think this might explain why we have like 10 different reports over the last 30 years talking about the same stuff, and we're still here talking about the same stuff, and we still got humongous corporate failures. Where are the corporate governance mechanisms in significant corporations like the ones run by Elon Musk? Where are they? So Musk buys Twitter. Twitter is a listed company, right? He buys it, buys all the shares, takes it private, wrecks it. So where are the corporate governance mechanisms to protect an overbearing individual who might be nuts or have an agenda that is personal, that does not align with the interests of the company more broadly? Where are the checks and balances for stopping him doing this stuff? Because thousands of people work for that company. Because Twitter could be considered global communications infrastructure. So it's not like I take over EDF, who is the company that runs most of the power infrastructure, in France as well, but even in this country, because here the governments have their own companies. They run a good chunk of the power infrastructure, right? They run the nuclear power stations. They run all sorts of stuff. Now, an overbearing individual buys it, takes it private, wrecks it, the thing shuts down, and the power goes off in the entire country, right? This has consequences. Okay, Twitter isn't as essential to life as having the lights come on, clearly, but a lot of people consider, because it's got tremendous influence and is one of the key ways in which people communicate globally, that it is something that is important. And guys, there are other investors in there. He's not by himself. He got a bunch of money from the Qataris. How do you think, Basically, anything that happens in the world has gotten a bunch of money from the Qataris. But he didn't actually come up with all the capital himself. He raised the money in order to buy Twitter. Some of it is his own money. Some money comes from other investors. These investors are represented in the shareholding and corporate structure somewhere. But there are absolutely no checks and balances. So Elon Musk is like a modern version of Robert Maxwell minus the cigar. And the fact that he's more fit and doesn't smoke on screen doesn't mean that he's got a different attitude to corporate governance. So 30 years down the line, we're watching in real time the same sort of corporate dysfunction take place. Now, this isn't a British company. Okay, so I'll give you that. So it's the rules of a foreign stock exchange in a foreign jurisdiction that determines how it's run. But we have examples of significant corporations significantly mismanaged by overbearing chief executive officers, right? Which comes back to my original point that the system is not very robust. Because you can say whatever you want about, ultimate best practice in organizing corporate governance, but it's still weak. When you come across somebody who wants to do bad stuff, systems are not resilient enough. At the same time, that's human nature. People get co-opted, you push out the people who complain and all this. Yeah. So he got in trouble. Now Twitter lost the remaining of their advertising revenue because the big media companies pulled out because Musk has the habit of liking people's tweets, and these tweets very often say stuff that are hugely controversial. There's a lot of information about these debates and the way that these things are run that I think this presentation offers you a little bit of context as to how we ended up with particular impressions of corporate governance and particular understandings of what constitutes best practice. And also it gives you some information as to, even though we do have a developed understanding of what best practice is, we still have a huge number of corporate failures left and right. Now, I'm not arguing against failure in itself. Failure is an essential component of capitalism. This is how resources get recycled. Companies do well, they make money. After a while, they don't do well. If they don't do well, they fail. Somebody else takes their assets and puts them into something productive. That's why capitalism is such a dynamic system, because you don't allow things that underperform to survive for very long. Luckily, this does not apply to universities, so we're going to be around for it until the government comes and shuts us down. Let's take a step back and think for a second about the ability of the general meeting to influence what the directors are doing. As we've seen in the past, there are some stuff that the directors cannot do by themselves. That's it. They cannot change the articles. Like they need majority. The majority to change the articles is at 3/4. The majority to dismiss the directors is at half, right? It's just an ordinary one. So if you want to change the articles, you need the general meeting consent. If you want to fiddle with shares, buy them, sell them, and all of the rest of it, when you're the corporation doing the buying and the selling, you also need the consent of the general meeting. If you want to excuse the directors for doing certain things that the law tells you are dodgy, excuse conflicts of interest and all the rest of it, we're going to see this over the next few discussions, you still need the general meeting to be involved. But that's pretty much it. There are some specific areas that have to do with reacting to takeovers or things that you might do in the stock market, but there isn't a great deal of obligatory involvement from the general meeting. Now, if we look at how the general meeting actually makes decisions for itself, when the shareholders get together to decide stuff, would you say that this approximates what happens in a democratic state? So when we're talking about the shareholders voting and selecting stuff, does it sound like a democracy to you? I mean, there are certain provisions to protect their rights and they're not taking advantage of, but if you have a minor shareholding, then, it's very little, you have very little influence. the main difference between a political process and, say, the voting in a democracy and what happens in corporations is that in a democracy, at least in theory, every vote is the same as everybody else's. Now, the impact of exercising the vote might be different, right? But all of you here, regardless of if you're British citizens, regardless of background, you have a vote. So your vote is the same as the vote of a rich guy who is the CEO of a corporation or a bum on the street. Right? If you're all citizens, you all have the same vote. Now, in practice, because here in this country, you vote for people split in constituencies, if the percentages are fairly close, and the person who goes first wins, right, in an election here. So within these smaller units, the person that comes first is the person that gets elected. So if the overwhelming majority of people in your area vote for one person, then it doesn't matter how committed you are to voting for the other person is never going to win. So if your constituency votes 75% Labour, then you could be voting for whomever else you want. Labour is always going to win. So in that sense, even though you have the same vote as somebody, say, across the river, your vote might not have any real impact in your constituency, while if they're across the river and over there is probably neck to neck, then each individual vote might actually make a difference. I mean, in Richmond, the Lib Dems won the vote by like 40, 50 votes or something, and then they lost in the last election, and then they came back because it was all so close that if you are in a marginal constituency, then each individual vote has a lot more impact. But in theory, each vote is as valuable as each other. In a general meeting, this is not the case at all. First of all, you have as many votes as you have shares. Some people have got more shares than others. So how many shareholders you have in the meeting doesn't really matter. It could be that you got one shareholder with 90 shares and then another 9 shareholders that have got a share each. So one of you gets to decide everything all the time because the other people just don't have enough shares. And that's not even counting the fact that not all shares are the same. So you could have shares with different voting rights. You could be in a special class of shares that has got higher voting power than everybody else, or lower. Right? So the rights attached to the shares can vary, and how many shares of each shareholder has can also vary. Which means that when they get to vote at general meeting, then the outcome is dependent on the nature and the voting power of the shares. This does not mean that it's the same for each shareholder. That's where the sort of democracy analogy of this fails. But a lot of people, because they hear voting, they kind of think about the political process. And when they hear about a sort of separation of powers that approximates a constitutional separation, they think about the political process as well. So it's similar, but it's not the same.